It was stolen with a ladder, a $60 million national treasure, a masterpiece of the Renaissance, protected by motion sensors, pressure plates, and a security system so advanced it was considered impenetrable. And it was all defeated by a man who simply climbed up some scaffolding, smashed a window, and walked out with it. There was no Ocean's 11-style team, no high-tech Mission Impossible gadgets, no inside man. There was just one lone figure in the Vienna night, a flimsy ladder, and the audacity to steal something so famous it could never be sold. This is the story of a heist so simple it's brilliant, so baffling it humiliated an entire nation. And it all centers on a single mesmerizing object, a golden salt cellar known as the Saliera. But the real question isn't just how he did it. The real question, the one that would haunt investigators for years, is why? Why steal something you can't fence, can't display, and can't ransom without bringing the entire world down on your head? The answer is far more bizarre than you could ever imagine. To understand the sheer insanity of this crime, you first have to understand what the Saliera actually is. Calling it a salt cellar is like calling the Grand Canyon a ditch. This isn't your grandmother's table shaker. Forged from rolled gold, vitreous enamel, and ebony, the Saliera is the only surviving gold work by the legendary Italian Renaissance artist, Benvenuto Cellini. Think of him as the rock star of his time. A sculptor, a goldsmith, a soldier, and an author whose autobiography reads like an action movie. He was a protege of Michelangelo, a rival of everyone, and a genius of unparalleled ego and talent. King Francis I of France commissioned the piece in 1540. He wanted something that would scream power, wealth, and sophistication. Cellini delivered. He sculpted two figures, a man and a woman, reclining in an elegant, almost impossible pose. The male figure is Neptune, the god of the sea, resting beside a tiny, intricate ship designed to hold salt. The female figure is Ceres, the goddess of the earth, seated next to a miniature triumphal arch meant to hold pepper. It was a stunning allegory. The sea and the earth coming together to enrich the king's table. Every muscle, every detail, from the tiny seahorses pulling Neptune's ship to the delicate patterns in the enamel, was a testament to a level of craftsmanship that has arguably never been surpassed. It was so breathtaking, so exquisitely perfect, that for centuries it was known as the Mona Lisa of sculptures. It wasn't just a piece of art, it was a symbol of an entire era of human achievement. And in 2003 it was sitting in Vienna's prestigious Kunsthistorisches Museum, the art history museum, supposedly one of the most secure buildings on the planet. The museum itself is a fortress, a colossal palace-like structure built in the late 1800s to house the immense art collection of the Habsburg emperors. Its walls are thick stone, its windows are barred, and its halls are patrolled by guards around the clock. The Saliera was the crown jewel of its collection, displayed in a specially designed, reinforced glass case. The case was wired. The floor around it was wired. The room was monitored by a web of motion detectors and infrared beams. The slightest vibration, the smallest change in pressure, the faintest whisper of movement after hours was supposed to trigger a deafening alarm, instantly alerting the guards in the central control room and automatically calling the Vienna police. The system was state-of-the-art, multi-layered, and redundant. It was by all accounts foolproof. But on the night of May 10, 2003, the foolproof system failed. The catalyst for the crime wasn't a master plan, but a coincidence. The museum was undergoing renovations. To work on the facade, construction crews had erected scaffolding all the way up the side of the building, right up to the first-floor windows. It was a temporary, necessary evil, a minor chink in the museum's otherwise impenetrable armor. For weeks, the scaffolding just stood there, a harmless metal skeleton against the grand historic stone. No one saw it as a threat. No one saw it as a ladder. The night was quiet. The city of Vienna slept. Inside the museum, the graveyard shift of security guards settled in for a long, uneventful evening. They made their rounds, monitored the screens, and trusted the silent electronic sentinels that watched over billions of dollars worth of history. In the early hours of Sunday, May 11th, a little before 4 a.m., one of those silent sentinels screamed. An alarm went off. It was a window sensor on the first floor, in the gallery where the Saliera was displayed. In the control room, a guard saw the alert. But alarms, especially in a building under construction, can be a nuisance. A gust of wind rattling a loose window frame, a bird hitting the glass, a glitch in the system. False alarms happen. The guard followed protocol, noted the alert, and dismissed it. He didn't send anyone to check. It was a single momentary blip on a screen, a decision made in a split second that would have catastrophic consequences. He had just unknowingly authorized the greatest art heist in Austrian history. While the guard turned his attention back to his other monitors, a shadow was moving through the darkness of the gallery. A man had climbed the scaffolding. He had forced open a window, triggering that first alarm. When nothing happened, no sirens, no running footsteps, no flashing lights, he knew he was in the clear. He slipped inside. He wasn't a cat burglar. He wasn't a trained commando. He was, as investigators would later discover, shockingly clumsy. He moved through the gallery, triggering not one, not two, but 3 more motion detector alarms. Each one sent a signal to the control room, and each one was dismissed as another glitch, another false positive from the same faulty zone. The thief was now standing in front of the display case, in front of $60 million of gold and genius. He didn't have sophisticated tools to disable the case's alarm. He didn't need them. He simply smashed the reinforced glass. The noise must have been incredible. A sharp explosion of shattering glass echoing through the silent, cavernous hall. But the museum was a stone behemoth. The control room was too far away, the walls too thick. No one heard it. He reached through the shattered glass, lifted the 11-inch tall, 13-pound sculpture, tucked it into a bag, and walked out the way he came. He climbed back down the scaffolding and melted into the pre-dawn emptiness of the city. The entire operation from start to finish took less than a minute. The sun rose over Vienna on Sunday morning. The museum remained closed to the public, as it always was on Mondays. It wasn't until the morning shift of guards began their rounds that the nightmare was discovered. A guard walked into the gallery and stopped dead. He stared at the display case, at the spiderweb of cracks in the glass and the gaping hole in the middle. He looked at the empty pedestal where the Saliera was supposed to be. For a moment there was just confusion, disbelief. It had to be a prank. Maybe it was removed for cleaning? But the shattered glass told a different story. The panic set in. Phone calls were made, a frantic cascade of communication up the chain of command. Within the hour, the museum was swarming with police. The director was summoned, his face ashen. The news broke first as a rumor, then as a horrifying confirmation. The Saliera was gone. It was a national humiliation. The Austrian media went into a frenzy. How could this happen? How could the country's most prized cultural artifact be stolen from its most prestigious museum, a building located right in the heart of the capital? The police launched one of the largest investigations in the nation's history. They sealed off the museum, dusting for fingerprints, looking for fibers, for any clue the thief might have left behind. They interviewed every guard, every employee, every construction worker. Interpol was alerted. A global bulletin was issued to every port, every airport, every auction house, and every major art dealer on the planet. The description of the Saliera was unmistakable. It was unique, unsellable. Fencing it on the open market would be impossible. Selling it on the black market to a private collector would be nearly as difficult. The kind of person who would buy a stolen masterpiece of this fame would be drawing a massive target on their own back. So the investigators were left with a ghost. No fingerprints, no DNA, no reliable eyewitnesses. The security camera footage was grainy and useless, showing only a masked figure. The guards who had dismissed the alarms were suspended, their careers in ruins, but they had no answers. They had simply trusted their protocol, which told them that multiple alarms from one zone in a short period of time likely indicated a technical malfunction, not a real-time robbery. The thief had exploited not a failure of technology, but a failure of human psychology. He had hidden in plain sight, using the system's own logic against it. As days turned into weeks, the trail went cold. The police had nothing. The most valuable salt cellar in the world had simply vanished, and the man who took it was a complete mystery. Seemed like the perfect crime. And then, 2 years later, a bizarre phone call would change everything. The thief was ready to talk, but he didn't just want money. He wanted to play a game. The phone rang in the Vienna offices of the Unica Insurance Group, the company holding the massive policy on the Saliera. It was November of 2005, more than 2 years after the heist. For 2 years there had been nothing. No leads, no suspects, no ransom notes. Just a crushing, expensive silence. The call was patched through to a senior director. The voice on the other end was calm, collected, and unervingly polite. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He said he was the one they were looking for. He said he had their $50 million salt cellar. And then he made his first demand. He wanted 10 million euros. A steep discount, but still a fortune. But getting the money wasn't going to be simple. This wasn't a transaction. It was an audition. The thief wanted to see who he was dealing with. He didn't trust the police, he said. He considered them clumsy, brutish. He would only deal with the insurance company directly. He laid out the first step of his elaborate game. He instructed the insurance company to buy a specific, unlocked mobile phone, a cheap disposable burner. Then they were to place an advertisement in a popular Austrian newspaper. The ad had to be worded in a very specific, cryptic way. It was a coded message, a signal to the thief that they were ready to play. It read something like, "Phone call received. Awaiting instructions for number." Once the ad was published, the thief would see it and send a text message to the insurance company's main office line, providing the phone number they were supposed to call on their new burner phone. It was a dizzying, paranoid circle of communication designed for one purpose: to keep him completely insulated, a ghost in the machine. The police, of course, were brought in immediately. They were furious at being sidelined, but their hands were tied. The Saliera was a national treasure, and its safe return was the absolute top priority. If that meant playing a thief's strange game, then they would play. But they wouldn't be playing fair. While the insurance executives prepared to become amateur spies, the Austrian Federal Police, the Bundeskriminalamt, began setting up one of the most sophisticated surveillance operations in their history. Every move the insurance company made would be tracked, every call monitored, every text message intercepted. They were letting the thief think he was in control, all while building a digital cage around him. The ad was placed. The wait was agonizing. Days turned into a week. Was it a hoax? A cruel prank? The investigators began to doubt, the executives began to sweat. And then it came. A simple text message to the corporate landline. Just a string of numbers. A phone number. The game was on. The lead insurance director, a man used to boardrooms and risk assessment, now found himself in a police surveillance van, a cheap plastic phone in his trembling hand. The police traced the number, but it was a dead end. A prepaid SIM card bought with cash months ago, activated only moments before the text was sent. The thief was careful. He was smart. The director dialed. The phone picked up on the first ring. It was the same calm, confident voice. He congratulated them on completing the first step. He sounded amused, like a chess master complimenting his opponent's opening move. Now for the real test. He wanted proof of funds. 5 million euros in used non-sequential bills to be ready for an exchange. He would provide the location for the drop in another 48 hours. But he added a chilling warning. He told them he was watching. He said if he saw a single police officer, a single suspicious-looking van, a single person who looked out of place, the deal was off. Forever. And the Saliera, he promised, would be melted down and sold for scrap gold. This was the moment the police had been waiting for. A physical drop. It was their only chance to catch him. They had 48 hours to plan an operation that was both completely invisible and totally foolproof. They staked out dozens of potential drop locations across Vienna. Parks, train stations, quiet suburban streets. Undercover officers disguised as street sweepers, tourists, and businessmen spread out across the city. Snipers took up positions on rooftops. GPS trackers, small enough to be sewn into a bag of money, were prepared. The entire city was becoming a chessboard, and they were positioning their pieces, waiting for the thief to move his king. The psychological pressure was immense. Who was this man? He wasn't acting like a typical smash-and-grab burglar. His meticulous planning, his calm demeanor, his desire to engage in this complex game of cat and mouse, it all pointed to something else. He was intelligent. He was patient. And most of all, he was arrogant. He didn't just want the money. He wanted to win. He wanted to prove that he was smarter than the insurance company, smarter than the entire Austrian police force. This wasn't just a crime for him, it was a performance. And he was the star, director, and writer of his own show. The 48 hours passed. The new burner phone buzzed to life. A text message. No call this time. Just a string of coordinates and a time. It was a parking garage at a busy shopping mall on the outskirts of Vienna. The drop was to happen in 2 hours, at the height of the evening rush. It was a brilliant choice. The location was a sea of civilian activity, making surveillance incredibly difficult. A team of undercover cops would stick out, but a lack of them would be tactical suicide. The police had to make a choice. They deployed a skeleton crew, their absolute best, disguised as shoppers and couples. The insurance director, now the designated bagman, was fitted with a covert earpiece. He was terrified, but he understood the stakes. He drove to the mall, a duffel bag filled with shredded paper and a GPS tracker on the seat beside him. The real money was with a backup team nearby, ready to be swapped in if the exchange seemed legitimate. He entered the parking garage, the air thick with the smell of exhaust and tension. He followed the instructions precisely, parking in the designated spot on the 3rd level. He was told to leave the bag on the hood of his car and walk away. "Don't look back," the text had warned. He did as he was told. He got out, placed the bag, and began walking towards the exit, his heart hammering against his ribs. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every distant footstep sounded like the thief approaching. The undercover cops, hidden in plain sight, watched and waited. A man in a trench coat, a woman pushing a stroller, a teenager on a skateboard. All of them were elite officers, their eyes scanning every car, every corner. Minutes felt like hours. Nothing happened. The bag just sat there, a lonely beacon under the flickering fluorescent lights. The director reached the stairwell, his earpiece silent. The surveillance teams reported no activity. No one had approached the car. It was a bust. A dry run. The thief was testing their response time, their methods. Frustrated, the director was ordered to return to his car. As he approached, he saw something tucked under his windshield wiper. It wasn't a ticket. It was a photograph. A Polaroid. His blood ran cold. It was a picture of him taken just moments before, as he was placing the bag on the hood. The photo was shot from a high angle from somewhere inside the garage. He had been watched the entire time. Then his personal cell phone, the one the thief wasn't supposed to know about, began to ring. It was an unknown number. He answered it, and the calm, confident voice on the other end said just 7 words before hanging up. "You brought friends. I'm very disappointed in you." The line went dead. The thief hadn't just avoided their trap. He had watched them set it, documented it, and called them out on it personally. He wasn't just a step ahead. He was in a different league entirely. The police had shown their hand, and he had just trumped it without even revealing his own. The game had just begun, and they were already losing. The silence on the other end of the line was heavier than any threat. For the investigators in that room, it was the sound of utter defeat. They hadn't just been outsmarted. They'd been publicly humiliated by a man who was, for all intents and purposes, a ghost. The media firestorm that followed was predictable and brutal. Headlines screamed about police incompetence. News anchors questioned how a national treasure could vanish from one of the most secure buildings in the country, and how the prime suspect was now openly mocking the very people trying to catch him. The pressure, already immense, became suffocating. Within days, the Vienna police did what they always do when a case becomes too big, too political, and too embarrassing to handle with normal procedure. They formed a SOCO, a Sonderkommission or Special Commission. This wasn't your average team of detectives. This was the big leagues. They pulled in the best of the best from every department: forensics, cybercrime, profiling, and old-school street investigation. And at the head of this newly formed dragon, they placed a man named Ernst Geiger. Geiger was a legend in the Vienna Police Department, a detective straight out of central casting. He was in his late 50s, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and a demeanor to match. He was a man who trusted his gut more than a computer printout and believed that all crimes, no matter how sophisticated, were ultimately solved by understanding human nature: greed, pride, desperation. He saw the Saliera Heist not as a technical marvel, but as an act of supreme arrogance. An arrogance Geiger knew was a flaw. It made people careless. It made them make mistakes. He assembled his team, laid out the few facts they had, and gave them a simple, chilling directive: find his mistake. He made one. They always do. The hunt was now officially on, led by a man who refused to be outplayed. But while Geiger and his SOCO team were setting up their war room, poring over blueprints and security footage, The thief was making his next move. He wasn't hiding in the shadows waiting for the heat to die down. He was proactively driving the narrative. He knew the police would be scrambling, so he decided to give them something to focus on. A ransom note. This wasn't going to be some crudely cut and pasted letter. Like the heist itself, it would be a masterpiece of planning and psychological manipulation. He typed the note on an untraceable computer, using software to randomize the font styles and sizes, making any typographic analysis impossible. He printed it on common office paper, the kind you could buy in any store in the world. He wore gloves, of course, ensuring no fingerprints would be left. But he needed to include something more. Something to prove beyond any doubt that he had the real Saliera. He looked at the golden sculpture, a marvel of the Renaissance, an object so beautiful it seemed to hum with its own history. And then, with a cold, detached precision, he took a tool and broke off a tiny, but distinct piece of the golden trident held by the figure of Neptune. It was an act of calculated vandalism, a message that said, "I have it, and I am not afraid to damage it further." He placed the tiny gold fragment into a small plastic bag and sealed it inside the envelope with the note. The envelope, addressed to the Unica Group, the insurance company that held the massive policy on the Saliera, was dropped into a public mailbox in a quiet, nondescript suburb of Vienna. No witnesses, no cameras, just another piece of mail in a sea of millions. For days, the SOCO team chased dead ends. They re-interviewed every guard, every museum employee. They ran background checks on every known art thief in Europe. They found nothing. The trail was colder than the Vienna winter. They were reacting, playing defense just as the thief intended. And then the letter arrived. It landed on the desk of a senior executive at Unica, who, upon opening it and seeing the small, glittering piece of gold, immediately called the police hotline. Within an hour, Ernst Geiger was holding the note, his face an unreadable mask of concentration. The thief's demands were laid out with unnerving clarity. He wanted 5 million euros, a staggering sum, but a mere fraction of the Saliera's 50 million euro insured value. This was a clever psychological play. The price wasn't astronomically high. It was just low enough to make the insurance company seriously consider paying it rather than risk a total loss. It was a business proposition, but it was the instructions that truly showcased the mind they were dealing with. The thief didn't want a suitcase of cash dropped in a park. That was amateur hour. This was a plan for the digital age. He demanded the insurance company purchase a specific model of a prepaid, unregistered mobile phone, a burner. They were to publish the last 7 digits of that phone's number in the classified section of a major Austrian newspaper, under the personal ads, with a specific, coded message, searching for phone number ending in the 7 digits. Call me. Once the ad was published, he would know the phone was active and in their hands. He would then send a text message to that phone with a series of questions. Questions only someone with intimate knowledge of the Saliera could answer. This was his way of verifying he was talking to the right people and not the police setting a trap. If they answered correctly, he would then provide instructions for the money drop. The note ended with a stark warning: any deviation from the instructions, any sign of police involvement, and the Saliera would be melted down. The tiny piece of Neptune's trident was the exclamation point on that threat. The room was silent as Geiger finished reading the note aloud to his team and the assembled executives from the museum and the insurance company. The air was thick with a mixture of fear and a strange, grudging admiration for the thief's sheer audacity. He had them. He had anticipated their every move and had constructed a communication method that was almost impossible to trace. A burner phone communicating via anonymous text messages was a nightmare for surveillance. They could try to triangulate the signal, but he would likely only keep the phone on for seconds at a time, moving constantly. The debate began almost immediately. The museum director, frantic at the thought of the masterpiece being destroyed, was desperate to pay. The insurance executives, looking at the numbers, saw a 5 million euro payment as a far better outcome than a 50 million euro payout. It was, to them, a simple cost-benefit analysis. But for Ernst Geiger, it was a non-starter. You don't negotiate with criminals. You don't reward theft. Paying the ransom would not only mean letting the thief win, but it would also set a dangerous precedent, painting a target on every other piece of art in Austria. "We don't pay," Geiger stated, his voice low and firm. "We use this communication. We play his game, we draw him out, and we catch him. This is our chance." He's finally talking to us. But the insurance company held the purse strings. They were the ones who would have to write the check. Geiger could advise, he could protest, but he couldn't make the final decision. The thief had brilliantly created a schism between the investigators and the victims. He had turned them against each other, forcing them to argue while he held all the cards. The note gave them a deadline. They had 48 hours to place the ad in the paper. The clock was ticking, and the fate of one of the world's greatest treasures hung on a decision that would pit a cop's iron will against a corporation's bottom line. The ultimatum landed like a grenade in the center of the room. 48 hours. It wasn't just a deadline, it was a challenge, a test of wills. For Chief Inspector Ernst Geiger, the answer was simple. You don't negotiate with thieves. You don't legitimize their crime by playing their game. It was a bedrock principle of law enforcement, a line you simply do not cross. To do so would be to open the floodgates, to tell every criminal in Austria that the nation's heritage was for sale. Geiger saw it in black and white. Find the thief, recover the Saliera, and put the person responsible behind bars for a very long time. But Geiger wasn't the only one with a stake in the game. In another, far more luxurious office, executives at the Unica Insurance Group were looking at the situation not in black and white, but in shades of green. The Saliera was insured for 50 million euros. That's over 60 million US dollars. If the masterpiece was never recovered, Unica would have to write a check for that staggering amount. A catastrophic loss that would send shockwaves through their balance sheets. The thief, however, wasn't asking for 50 million. He was asking for a fraction of that. To the executives, the math was brutal but simple. Paying a ransom, as distasteful as it was, wasn't a moral failure. It was a sound business decision. It was damage control. So the battle began, not on the streets of Vienna, but in conference rooms and overheated phone calls. On one side, a career cop, a man who had dedicated his life to the rule of law. On the other, a multi-billion-dollar corporation, an entity legally obligated to protect its shareholders' interests. The museum director was caught in the crossfire, pleading with both sides, his only goal the safe return of his museum's crown jewel. Geiger argued with every fiber of his being. He explained that paying the ransom would turn the police into mere delivery boys for a criminal. It would compromise the entire investigation. They could set a trap, he insisted. They could use the negotiation to lure the thief out. But the Unica representatives were unmoved. Trap was a risk. What if it failed? What if the thief panicked and destroyed the Saliera? They would be out their ransom money and still have to pay the 50 million euro claim. No, they wanted the sure thing. They held the purse strings, and in a situation like this, money talks louder than a police badge. In the end, it was a fight Geiger couldn't win. The Austrian government, wanting to avoid an international embarrassment and a massive insurance payout that could have wider economic ripples, quietly sided with the insurer. The decision was made. They would pay. Geiger was furious, but he was also a professional. He had his orders. If they were going to play the thief's game, he would make damn sure they controlled the board. He and his team would orchestrate the entire process, turning the ransom exchange into the biggest sting operation in Austrian history. The first step was the newspaper ad. The thief's note had been specific, a classified ad in the Courier, one of Austria's most widely read daily papers. The team of detectives, insurance adjusters, and psychologists huddled together, debating the exact wording. It had to be a perfect dog whistle, meaningless to the millions of other readers, but an unmistakable yes to the one person they needed to reach. They couldn't say, "We'll pay for the golden salt cellar." It had to be coded, personal, something that referenced the secret knowledge only they and the thief shared. After hours of deliberation, they settled on a few simple, cryptic lines. The ad was placed under the personal section, buried among messages of lonely hearts and lost pets. It read something like, "Calling Sally. We have the 5 you asked for. Get in touch. Sally for Saliera. 5 for the 5 million euro figure that had been discussed." It was a shot in the dark, a message in a bottle tossed into a sea of newsprint. The ad ran on a Tuesday, and then nothing. Wednesday came and went. The police monitored every phone line, every email server connected to the museum and the insurance company. Silence. Thursday. The city of Vienna bustled around them, oblivious to the high-stakes drama playing out in secret. Geiger's office felt like a pressure cooker. Every ringing phone made them jump. Every unfamiliar email was scrutinized. But the thief had gone dark. A week passed. Then two. The hope that had surged through the investigation began to curdle into dread. Had the thief seen the ad? Did he get spooked? Was he toying with them? Or worse, was the initial note a hoax from the very beginning? Maybe the real thief had simply melted away. The Saliera already sold on the black market or, in their darkest moments of fear, destroyed forever. The Unica executives grew more and more agitated, imagining their €50 million liability hardening from a possibility into a certainty. Geiger, despite his opposition to the payment, felt a different kind of frustration. He was a hunter with no trail, a detective with no clues. The thief had made one move, then vanished, leaving them suspended in an agonizing state of limbo. The investigation was hitting a wall. The forensic evidence from the museum had yielded nothing. The security guard, the only witness, couldn't provide a description clear enough to produce a useful sketch. They had interviewed every known art thief, every disgruntled museum employee, every major player in the European underworld. They had nothing. The most expensive and sophisticated manhunt in Austrian history was being defeated by silence. By the beginning of August 2003, nearly 3 months after the heist, a grim resignation had settled over the team. The operation to pay the ransom was quietly shelved. The surveillance was scaled back. It seemed the thief had outsmarted them all. He had committed the perfect crime and had the discipline to simply disappear with his prize. The media had moved on to other stories, and the public began to speak of the Saliera in the past tense, as another one of history's great unsolved losses. And then, on a sweltering afternoon in late August, a new message arrived. It wasn't a handwritten note left on a park bench. This was different. This was modern. A new disposable cell phone, purchased with cash, had been used to send a text message to a senior executive at Unica. The message was short, chilling, and to the point. It contained a new set of numbers, a bank account in a country with lax privacy laws, and a single stark instruction. But it was the second part of the message that made the blood run cold. It was a photo, a close-up, high-resolution image. It showed a small, gleaming golden trident, resting on a copy of that day's newspaper. It was the trident held by the figure of Neptune. It had been detached from the top of the Saliera. The thief was back. He was proving he still had the masterpiece, and he was proving he was willing to break it apart. The message was clear. This was no longer a negotiation. This was a demand, and the game had just entered a far more dangerous phase. The gold trident was authenticated within hours. It was real, a tiny gleaming piece of a €50 million masterpiece, ripped from its base and mailed to an insurance company. The news hit the Vienna police department like a physical blow. For months, they had operated on the theory that the thief was a professional, someone who understood the value of the object, someone who would treat it with care until a ransom could be negotiated. That theory was now shattered, lying in pieces just like the Saliera itself. In its place was a chilling new reality. They were dealing with someone unpredictable, someone volatile, and someone who was not afraid to destroy one of the world's greatest treasures. The pressure on chief investigator Ernst Geiger became immense, almost unbearable. The media, which had been buzzing with speculation, now erupted into a firestorm of outrage and fear. How could this have happened? How could the police have let the trail go so cold that the thief felt empowered to start mutilating the prize? Editorials across Austria and Europe screamed for answers. The public wanted a culprit, but more than that, they wanted the Saliera back, whole and unharmed. And now that seemed less likely than ever. Inside the investigation, the mood shifted from frustration to grim determination. The game had changed, so their strategy had to change with it. This was no longer a passive waiting game. It was an active manhunt, and their only real lead was the ghost they were chasing. They needed to understand him. They needed to get inside his head. Criminal profilers were brought in, poring over every detail of the case. The break-in itself was a study in contradictions. The thief had defeated a state-of-the-art security system with shocking ease, suggesting a high level of sophistication. He had climbed scaffolding, smashed a window, and bypassed motion detectors. It was bold, athletic, and precise. But then there were the mistakes. The clumsy exit, the accidental triggering of an alarm in a nearby shop. It didn't quite add up. A world-class professional cat burglar wouldn't be so sloppy. And a world-class professional certainly wouldn't start breaking off pieces of their multi-million-dollar leverage. The profilers began to paint a picture not of a master criminal, but of an amateur who got incredibly lucky. An opportunist. Someone who saw a chance and took it, without a fully formed plan for what came next. This new profile was terrifying. Professional has rules. They understand the transaction. You pay the ransom, you get the goods. An amateur? An amateur is driven by ego, by panic, by a sense of being in over their head. They make rash decisions. They do things like mailing a piece of a national treasure to prove a point. The thief's message, "I am here, I have it, and I am in control," was seen by the profilers as a cry of desperation as much as a threat. He was losing his patience. The silence from the authorities, which was intended to frustrate him, had instead enraged him. He felt ignored, disrespected, and now he was lashing out. The demand for €5 million, later raised to 10 million, was now officially on the table. The Unica Insurance Group, the company that had received the trident, was in an impossible position. They were on the hook for the full insured value €50 million if the Saliera was lost forever. Paying a €10 million ransom, as astronomical as it sounded, was actually the fiscally responsible choice. It was simple math. But for the police, it wasn't that simple. You can't just pay a criminal. It sets a dangerous precedent. It encourages every would-be thief to aim for the world's biggest prizes, knowing they'll get a payday. It turns national heritage into a commodity for extortion. A tense, high-stakes debate unfolded behind closed doors. The museum director was frantic, begging them to do whatever it took to save the artwork. The insurance executives were pushing for a payment. The police were caught in the middle, bound by procedure and the law. But the trident changed the calculus for everyone. The threat of total destruction was no longer hypothetical. They could already picture it. The Saliera melted down, its gold sold for scrap, its enamel figures smashed to dust, lost to the world forever. The risk was too great. A decision was made. They would play the thief's game. They would open a channel of communication, but they would do it on their terms. Ernst Geiger knew a direct, secret negotiation was what the thief wanted. It would give him all the power. So they decided to do the opposite. They would take the negotiation public. Using the media as their intermediary, the police and Unica issued a carefully worded joint statement. They confirmed they had received proof that the thief had the Saliera. They acknowledged his demand. And then came the crucial line. "We are prepared to negotiate for the Saliera's safe and complete return." It was a masterstroke of reverse psychology. By going public, they put the spotlight directly on the thief. The whole world was now watching him. If he harmed the Saliera now, he wouldn't just be a thief. He would be a cultural vandal of historic proportions. He would be reviled. They were appealing to the one thing the profilers were certain he possessed in abundance: his ego. He wanted to be seen as a brilliant mastermind, not a clumsy thug who destroys priceless art. They were giving him a chance to cement that legacy, to be the one who outsmarted everyone but was still reasonable enough to make a deal. For weeks, the world held its breath. The public appeal hung in the air, a baited hook cast into the criminal underworld. Had the thief taken it? Or had he disappeared again, perhaps spooked by the public attention? The investigators were on edge. Every day that passed without a response increased the likelihood that the Saliera was gone for good. Then another message arrived. This one didn't come in the mail. It was far more clever. The thief sent an anonymous text message to a police hotline. It was a single line of cryptic text, directing them to a specific phone booth in Vienna. Taped inside the phone booth, investigators found a cheap, prepaid cell phone. A burner. The police knew this was it. The real negotiation was about to begin. They took the phone back to their headquarters, setting it up in a secure operations room, wires running from it to tracing and recording equipment. The entire team gathered around, waiting. Hours later, the burner phone rang. The sound cut through the silent tension of the room like a gunshot. A detective, chosen for his calm demeanor, answered the call. There was no voice on the other end. Instead, there was a series of electronic tones, a data burst. It was a text message, sent from another burner phone. The message was clear, concise, and chillingly precise. It contained a new demand and a set of instructions for the ransom drop. The thief wasn't just asking for money anymore. He was choreographing a performance. The instructions were a complex web of locations, timings, and codes. He wanted the 10 million euros in used non-sequential bills, packed into a specific type of duffel bag. The drop was to be made by a single person driving a specific model of car. But the most alarming part was the route. The thief had designed a path that would take the courier through a maze of Vienna's busiest streets and narrowest alleyways, a route designed to make surveillance all but impossible. He specified turns to be made at exact seconds, stops to be made in locations with no camera coverage, and a final drop point that was still unknown. He would provide the final location via another text, but only when the courier was already in motion. The investigators looked at the plan laid out on the map. It was brilliant. It was paranoid. It was almost foolproof. They realized the man they were dealing with, amateur or not, was far more cunning than they had ever imagined. He had learned from his mistakes. He had studied their methods. And he had designed a trap not just to get his money, but to humiliate the very people who were trying to catch him. The police now had a choice to make: walk into the trap and risk losing both the money and the thief, or refuse, and risk the Saliera being destroyed forever. For the Viennese police, and specifically for Ernst Geiger, the head of the major crimes unit, this was more than a choice. It was a nightmare scenario played out in the full glare of the world's media. Geiger was an old-school cop, a man who believed in evidence, procedure, and the fundamental principle that you do not negotiate with criminals. Giving in to ransom demands, in his view, was like pouring blood in the water. It only encouraged more sharks. But this wasn't just any criminal, and this wasn't just any stolen item. This was the Mona Lisa of sculptures, a national treasure whose value couldn't be calculated in euros. The pressure from the museum, from the Ministry of Culture, from politicians terrified of being the ones who let the Saliera get destroyed, was immense. They saw a priceless artifact on the line. Geiger saw something else. He saw a game. The thief wasn't just asking for money. He was dictating the terms of engagement with an almost theatrical flair. The demand for 10 million euros was specific. Not 50, not 100, just 10. Enough to be life-changing, but not so much as to be impossible to gather. It was a calculated, almost reasonable demand, which made it all the more insidious. He wanted it in used, non-sequential bills. A classic demand, but one that created a logistical headache of epic proportions. Gathering that much untraceable cash takes time. It requires coordinating with banks, pulling bills from circulation, and ensuring not a single serial number can be tracked. It was the first test in the thief's game, a test of the authorities' competence and their resolve. Geiger knew he was being played. Every instinct told him the thief was laying a trap. But the alternative, calling the bluff and waking up to news that a 400-year-old masterpiece had been melted into a worthless lump of gold, was unthinkable. So with gritted teeth, the decision was made. They would play the game. They would assemble the ransom, but they would do it on their terms. This wouldn't be a simple handover. It would be a sting operation, the largest Vienna had ever seen. The thief's instructions came via another anonymous text message. The drop was to be made in a specific trash can on the Wiedner Hauptstrasse, a busy street in Vienna, at precisely 2 a.m. A duffel bag with the 10 million euros inside. No tricks, no police, or the deal was off. Of course there would be police. There would be police everywhere. For days leading up to the drop, Geiger's team swarmed the area. Undercover officers disguised as street sweepers, late-night revelers, taxi drivers. Snipers were positioned on rooftops, their scopes trained on the designated trash can. Surveillance vans packed with listening equipment were parked blocks away, disguised as delivery trucks. Every sewer grate was checked, every alleyway mapped. They were confident that whoever came to pick up that bag would not be walking away. The night of the drop was cold and tense. The city hummed with a nervous energy. Geiger and his team watched the feeds from a dozen hidden cameras, their eyes scanning for anything out of place. The minutes ticked by. 1:45 a.m. 1:50. The street was mostly empty, save for their own people. At 1:58, a lone figure in a heavy coat walked down the street, placed a duffel bag in the trash can, and walked away without looking back. It was one of their own, the bait. Now all they had to do was wait. 2 a.m. came and went. Nothing. 2:15. The street remained silent. 2:30. A street cleaning vehicle made its scheduled pass, the driver one of Geiger's men. He didn't even glance at the can. 3 a.m. The tension in the command post was unbearable. Had they been spotted? Was he just late? Or was this part of the game? At 3:17 a.m., Geiger's phone buzzed. An unknown number. It was a text message. It contained only 2 words. Nice try. The thief hadn't even shown up. He'd never intended to. The entire operation, the dozens of officers, the weeks of planning, the 10 million euros sitting in a garbage can. It was all a colossal waste of time. He had made the most powerful law enforcement agency in Austria dance to his tune, only to stand them up on the dance floor. It was a stunning display of arrogance and a humiliating blow for Geiger and his team. The thief wasn't just one step ahead. He was playing a different game entirely, and the police were just pawns on his board. The media, catching wind of the failed sting, was merciless. Headlines screamed of police incompetence. The public began to wonder if the authorities were capable of handling this at all. The psychological toll on the investigators was immense. They had been publicly outsmarted. The thief had proven he could watch them, anticipate their moves, and mock them with impunity. A few days later, a new message arrived. This time the tone was different. The games were over. The price was still 10 million euros, but the instructions were far more complex, designed to make a police trap impossible. He demanded the money be placed in a locker at the Praterstern railway station, one of Vienna's busiest transport hubs. The key to the locker was to be left on a specific bench in the nearby Prater Park. But here was the twist. The instructions for which bench would be delivered via a call to a public payphone inside the station, a call that would come at an unspecified time during the evening rush hour. It was a logistical nightmare. The station was a sea of humanity, thousands of commuters passing through every hour. Trying to mount a covert surveillance operation in that environment was a fool's errand. There were too many faces, too many exits, too many places to hide. Any undercover cop would stick out to someone who was looking for them, and they knew the thief would be looking. Geiger knew it was almost certainly another trap, another feint designed to exhaust his resources and make him look foolish again. But what choice did he have? The threat to the Saliera was still hanging over their heads, so they tried. They scrambled to cover the station, planting plainclothes officers in the crowds, trying to look like bored commuters or tourists. They monitored the payphones. They had teams ready to sweep the park the moment they got the location of the bench. It was a chaotic, desperate plan, and everyone knew it. The evening rush hour began, and the station swelled with people. The noise was deafening. Every person who lingered a second too long near a payphone, every face that seemed a little too watchful, became a suspect. The hours dragged on. 5 p.m., 6 p.m. The crowds began to thin. The police were on edge, their nerves frayed. Then at 7:12 p.m., one of the payphones rang. An officer disguised as a janitor answered it. The voice on the other end was digitally distorted, cold and robotic. It gave a location, not a bench in the park, but a different locker, this one at the Westbahnhof station on the other side of the city. The key was to be taped to the underside of a table at a specific cafe near the station. They had 30 minutes. It was a classic misdirection. While Geiger's main force was concentrated at Praterstern, the real location was miles away. He had split their resources, created chaos, and sent them on a wild goose chase. Geiger immediately dispatched tactical teams, sirens blaring through the Vienna streets, racing against the clock. But they all knew it was hopeless. 30 minutes was not enough time to set up a proper surveillance net, not in a busy urban area. They were going in blind. When the first officers arrived at the cafe, panting and out of breath, they found the table. They checked underneath. There was a piece of tape but no key, and stuck to the top of the table, held down by a sugar dispenser, was a small, neatly folded note. It was a printout of a map of Vienna. 2 locations were circled in red ink. The first was the Praterstern station, where the bulk of Geiger's forces still were. The second was the police headquarters itself. There was no message, no words, just the map. The meaning was clear and it was chilling. The thief wasn't just watching the drop points. He was watching the watchers. He knew their playbook, their tactics, their headquarters. He was everywhere, and they were nowhere closer to catching him. They had been completely and utterly outmaneuvered, and the Saliera was still out there, somewhere in the dark. The silence that followed was, in many ways, louder than the alarm that never rang. Months bled into one another. Summer's heat gave way to the crisp chill of autumn, and then the biting cold of a Viennese winter. The Saliera was gone. It had vanished from the world, swallowed by the night, leaving behind a vacuum that was filled with rumor, speculation, and a thick, suffocating cloud of institutional shame. The Vienna police, once a symbol of European efficiency, were now the butt of a continental joke. Newspapers ran cartoons of bumbling detectives tripping over their own feet, while a shadowy figure tiptoed away with the golden salt cellar. Talk shows debated their incompetence. The pressure from the government, from the art world, from the public was immense. Every lead turned into a dead end. Every theory collapsed under its own weight. They had interviewed hundreds of people, chased down every known art thief, and analyzed every scrap of evidence, only to come up with nothing. It was as if the thief had been a phantom, a ghost who could walk through walls and disable laser grids with a whisper. While Vienna's finest chased these shadows, Robert Mang was living in a private renaissance. He wasn't in some high-tech villainous lair. He wasn't jet-setting across the globe. He was in his small, unassuming apartment, a place so mundane it was the perfect camouflage. And there, in the quiet intimacy of his own home, the Saliera wasn't just a trophy. It was a companion. He didn't hide it in a safe or lock it in a vault. He kept it out. He placed it on a velvet cloth under his bed. Each night before he slept, he would pull it out and simply look at it. He'd study the impossibly fine details Cellini had crafted almost 500 years before. The gentle curve of Ceres, the powerful posture of Neptune. He would run his fingers ever so lightly over the enameled gold, feeling the history, the genius, the lifeblood of the artist. This wasn't about money. This was about possession in its purest form. He hadn't stolen a treasure. He believed he had rescued it from the cold, sterile prison of a glass box, where crowds of tourists would gawk at it for a few seconds before moving on to the next exhibit. In his world, the Saliera was finally appreciated. It was loved, but even a masterpiece can become a gilded cage. For Mang, the thrill had always been in the acquisition, the intellectual battle, the flawless execution. The quiet life of a curator, even to a collection of one, began to wear on him. The silence he had cultivated was now deafening. The secret he held was a weight. And with that weight came a fatal, creeping emotion for a man in his position: ego. He had pulled off the impossible. He had outsmarted the entire Austrian state. And no one knew. No one could appreciate his genius. The world saw a mystery, but he saw his masterpiece of a crime. And he developed an itch, a burning desire to let them know just a little who they were dealing with. He wanted to play the game again. So, after nearly 2 years of complete and utter silence, he made his move. It wasn't a grand declaration. It was a subtle, almost clumsy ripple in the water. An anonymous tip was sent not to the police but to the Unica Group, the insurance company that held the massive policy on the Saliera. The message was simple. The salt cellar was safe and it could be returned. For a price. 10 million euros. The investigators, who had all but given up hope, were jolted back to life. It was the first sign of the ghost in over 24 months. The ransom demand itself was almost insulting. 10 million euros was a fraction of the Saliera's estimated $60 million value. This wasn't a professional art theft syndicate looking for a massive payday. This was something else. Something personal. The police immediately took over the negotiation, but they were flying blind. Their only point of contact was a disposable cell phone number provided by the thief. They were in his world now, playing by his rules. The communication that followed was a bizarre cat-and-mouse game played out through cryptic text messages. The thief was cautious, paranoid, and displayed an almost amateurish approach to the ransom negotiation, a stark contrast to the sheer brilliance of the heist itself. He would send a message, then the phone would go dead for days. He gave instructions that were vague and contradictory. He seemed to be testing them, probing their defenses, enjoying the dance. For the police, it was agonizing. They were communicating with a man who had humiliated them, and they had to play the part of the compliant victim. They agreed to the price. They agreed to the terms. They just needed a location for the drop. Weeks turned into another month. The text would come at odd hours. Prepare the money. Then silence. No small bills. Then silence. Each message was a breadcrumb, and the police followed, assembling a massive undercover operation. This was their one and only shot at redemption. They couldn't afford to fail. Finally, the thief gave them what they wanted: a time and a place, a drop-off point. He wanted the 10 million euros in a large bag, to be left near a specific signal box along a remote stretch of railway line between the towns of Tulln and Krems, just outside Vienna. It was a strange choice. An open, exposed area. The police were ecstatic. It seemed like a mistake, a fatal error from a man who had until now been flawless. They saw their opening. They saw the end of the line for their ghost. The plan was a textbook police sting. They would have dozens of officers hidden in the surrounding woods. Snipers from the elite Cobra unit would be positioned with clear lines of sight. They would have thermal imaging, night vision, and agents disguised as railway workers. The bag with the money would be real, but it would be fitted with a GPS tracker. The moment anyone touched that bag, the entire area would be locked down. Helicopters, ground units, dogs, the whole force would descend on that one spot. There would be no escape. They meticulously planned every detail, every contingency. They studied maps, they ran simulations, they timed the response down to the second. They were building the perfect cage. As the day of the drop approached, a palpable excitement filled the Vienna police headquarters. They were finally on the offensive. They were no longer the punchline. They were the hunters, and their prey was walking right toward them. They had the location, they had the manpower, and they had the element of surprise. Or so they thought. But as the police laid their perfect trap, they overlooked one fundamental truth about their adversary. A man who could plan a heist with such impossible precision, a man who could study his target for years, a man who could anticipate every camera, every sensor, every guard rotation, was not a man who would make a foolish mistake. He wasn't choosing a location at random. He wasn't getting sloppy. He was doing exactly what he had always done. He was thinking 10 steps ahead. He knew they would be watching. He knew they would be waiting. And as the heavily armed Cobra snipers took their positions, camouflaged and invisible in the trees, they had no idea that somewhere in the darkness, another pair of eyes was watching them. The thief wasn't walking into their trap. He was the one holding the tripwire. Robert Meng sat in his car, parked on a quiet residential street a quarter-mile away, a pair of high-powered binoculars pressed to his eyes. He wasn't just watching the drop-off point. He was watching the watchers. He scanned the rooftops, the darkened windows of the surrounding buildings, the thickets of trees. He saw the subtle glint of a rifle scope, the unnatural stillness of a bush that should have been rustling in the breeze, the faint flicker of an infrared beam. He lowered the binoculars and smiled. Amateurs. They had surrounded the park with the textbook dragnet, a perfect circle of force. And in the center they had placed their cheese. But the mouse wasn't in the maze. The mouse was sitting comfortably outside, watching the scientists scurry around, wondering why their experiment wasn't working. Meng picked up his burner phone. He knew the police would be on edge, their nerves frayed, adrenaline pumping as they waited for a ghost to appear. It was the perfect time to call. On the other end, Chief Inspector Ernst Geiger snatched the receiver. His voice was tight, strained. The call was immediately being traced, recorded, analyzed. Meng didn't care. He spoke in that same infuriatingly calm voice. He didn't ask about the money. He didn't mention the Saliera. Instead, he asked a simple question. Is it a nice night for a stakeout? Silence. On the other end of the line, Geiger's blood ran cold. The entire command center, a room buzzing with tense energy moments before, fell deathly quiet. Every officer froze, looking at each other with wide, disbelieving eyes. It was impossible. How could he know? Geiger gripped the phone tighter, his knuckles turning white. He tried to play it cool, to bluff. I don't know what you're talking about. Meng chuckled. It was a low, condescending sound. Oh, I think you do, Chief Inspector. Let's see. You have 2 snipers in the trees on the west side of the park. Very cliché, by the way. You have a team in a white van, a plumber's van, really? Parked on the corner of Schillerstrasse. And you have at least a dozen plainclothes officers trying to look casual while they stroll around with bulky jackets in mild weather. Tell your man near the fountain to stop scratching his ear. He's going to give away his earpiece. The command center erupted into a quiet chaos of panicked whispers. Geiger was speechless. It was like the thief was floating above them, a phantom eye in the sky, seeing their every move. The precision was terrifying. He wasn't guessing. He was describing their exact deployment in real time. The paranoia in the room was suffocating. Was there a mole? Was their communication compromised? Had one of their own betrayed them? The truth was so much simpler and so much more humiliating. Robert Mang had simply outthought them. He knew how they would think, where they would position their people. He hadn't hacked their systems, he had hacked their minds. "You see, Inspector," Mang continued, his voice dripping with condescension, "you're playing checkers. I'm playing chess. And you just lost your queen." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Your little trap was insulting. Did you really think I would be so stupid as to walk into such an obvious ambush? You have wasted my time. And now the price has gone up." Geiger finally found his voice, a mixture of fury and desperation. "What do you want?" "The terms have changed," Mang said coolly. "The location is no longer of my choosing. It will be of your choosing. And that is going to make it so much harder for you. Tomorrow, I want you to place an advertisement in the classified section of the Courier, the largest newspaper in Vienna. The ad should be in the miscellaneous for sale section. It will read, 'Seeking buyer for antique salt cellar. Call this number.' And you will list a new, clean phone number." This was a bizarre twist. Why would he want them to choose the number? "And then what?" Geiger asked, his team frantically scribbling notes. "Then you will wait. A potential buyer will call you. They will not know who you are or what they are truly involved in. They will be an innocent civilian. A pawn. You will arrange a meeting with this person to appraise the item. You will give this person the 10 million euros. All of it. In a standard briefcase. You will tell them it is a down payment for a much larger art collection. You will give them a cover story so convincing that they will believe it without question. And then you will let them go." The investigators looked at each other, utterly bewildered. This made no sense. They were supposed to hand over 10 million euros to a random person who answered a newspaper ad? "You want us to give the money to a complete stranger?" Geiger asked, convinced the man was insane. "Precisely," Meng replied. "Because I will be watching them, not you. I will follow this innocent courier. And at a time and place of my choosing, when they are alone and you are nowhere in sight, I will retrieve the money from them. If I see a single police officer, a single unmarked car, a single surveillance camera pointed in their direction, the deal is off. The Saliera will be melted down into a worthless lump of gold. You will not be able to follow them. You will not be able to track them. You will have to simply hand over the money and trust that your pawn delivers it to the right person." It was diabolically brilliant. Meng was creating a human firewall, an unknowing mule who would be completely clean. The police couldn't risk tailing a civilian too closely, and they would have no idea where or when Meng would make his move. He could strike an hour later or a day later. He could follow them to the grocery store, to their home, to their office. The police would be completely blind. They would have to give up all control, placing 10 million euros and the fate of a national treasure into the hands of a random person, and then just hope. It was a psychological masterstroke, designed to neuter the entire police force and turn their own manpower against them. "You are forcing us to be complicit in endangering a civilian," Geiger shot back, trying to find a moral high ground. "No, Inspector," Meng corrected him. "I am forcing you to make a choice. The safety of one civilian, who will be completely unharmed and will likely never even know what happened, versus the survival of a $500 million masterpiece. The choice is yours. But I would remind you that the world is watching. The ad runs tomorrow. Don't be late." And with that, the line went dead. Geiger slammed the phone down. The command center was a tomb of silent fury and disbelief. They had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and openly mocked. Every piece of their strategy had been turned into a weapon against them. The thief wasn't just a common criminal. He was a grandmaster, and he had just placed them in checkmate. All their technology, their manpower, their training, it was all useless. Meng had created a scenario where their greatest strengths were now their greatest weaknesses. If they surveilled the civilian, the Saliera was destroyed. If they didn't, a thief walked away with 10 million euros. They spent the rest of the night in a frantic, desperate haze. They ran simulations, they argued, they brainstormed. Every potential plan led to a dead end. Every strategy had a fatal flaw. They were trapped. The thief hadn't just stolen a sculpture. He had stolen their power, their control, their confidence. As the first rays of dawn broke over Vienna, a defeated quiet settled over the investigators. They knew what they had to do. An officer was dispatched, not with a rifle or a warrant, but with a small handwritten piece of paper. He drove to the main office of the Courier newspaper, walked to the front desk, and paid in cash to place a new ad in the classifieds. It was a surrender printed in black and white for the entire city to see. Seeking buyer for antique salt cellar. The trap was no longer for the thief. It was for them, and they had just willingly walked right into it. The phone rang. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit office of the Vienna police, that simple sound cut through the air like a gunshot. For 2 years and 8 months they had chased a ghost. Now that ghost was calling them. Chief Inspector Ernst Geiger snatched the receiver, his knuckles white. The call was patched through a recorder, every officer in the room frozen in place, listening. A voice came on the line. It wasn't deep or menacing. It was unremarkable, almost disappointingly normal. The man on the other end said he was responding to the ad about the salt cellar. He was the current owner. Geiger, playing the part of a representative for a wealthy, discreet buyer, kept his own voice steady, a mask of calm professionalism over a career's worth of adrenaline. The caller was cautious, paranoid. He spoke in clipped sentences, revealing nothing. He wanted to know who the buyer was. He wanted to know how the exchange would work. He wanted proof of funds. Geiger played along, weaving a story of an eccentric collector who valued privacy above all else. Every word was a calculated risk. Push too hard and the ghost would vanish again. Be too passive and they'd lose control. The caller dictated the terms. He would provide a single, small piece of the Saliera as proof of possession, a tiny gold trident, broken off from the figure of Neptune. He would send it to a P.O. box. If the buyer was satisfied, they would proceed to negotiate a price. And then the line went dead. The room exhaled. They had him on the hook, but he was still controlling the game. Days later, a small padded envelope arrived at the designated post office box. Inside, nestled in cotton, was the trident. It was unmistakable. Experts from the museum confirmed its authenticity within the hour. It was real. The ghost was real. And he was ready to sell. The second phone call came a week later. This time the voice was more confident. He had proven he had the goods. Now he wanted his money. He named his price. 10 million euros. A fraction of its true worth, but a king's ransom for a single man. Geiger, still in character, agreed without hesitation. The price didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the meeting. The caller laid out the rules with chilling precision. The exchange would happen in a public place. A busy shopping center on the outskirts of Vienna. The buyer's representative would come alone. He would carry the money in a standard briefcase. The caller would approach him. Any sign of police, any deviation from the plan, and he would disappear forever, and the Saliera would be melted down. He gave them a date and a time just 48 hours away. And again the line went dead. The final move had been made. The endgame was here. The briefing room was electric with tension. This wasn't just an arrest. It was a recovery operation for a national treasure. The plan had to be flawless. Over 100 officers were mobilized. Plainclothes detectives would saturate the shopping center, posing as shoppers, janitors, store clerks. Sharpshooters would take positions on overlooking rooftops, their scopes trained on the meeting point. A communications network was set up, a web of whispers and code words connecting every officer. The undercover detective chosen to be the representative was a veteran, a man with ice in his veins, but even he felt the immense pressure. He was the bait. In his hand he would carry a briefcase, not with 10 million euros, but with neatly cut stacks of paper, a thin layer of real currency on the top. His every move, every word would be monitored. The signal to move in was a simple, innocuous phrase he would say to the suspect. "The weather is certainly nice today." When those words were spoken, the trap would spring. On the day of the exchange, a nervous quiet settled over the city's police force. Geiger sat in a surveillance van parked a block away from the shopping center, a bank of monitors in front of him showing dozens of camera feeds. He watched the undercover detective walk into the mall, briefcase in hand, and take a seat on a bench in the central atrium, right next to a large fountain. He looked like any other businessman waiting for a colleague. The minutes ticked by. 10 minutes. 20. Shoppers milled about, children laughed, the fountain bubbled. To the outside world, it was a perfectly normal afternoon. To Geiger and his team, it was the most agonizing wait of their lives. Was it a setup? Did the thief get spooked? Had this whole elaborate 2.5-year chase been for nothing? Geiger's jaw was clenched so tight it ached. He watched the feeds, his eyes scanning every face in the crowd. He was looking for someone nervous, someone watching, someone out of place. But there was nothing. Just a sea of ordinary people. 30 minutes past the meeting time. 45. The hope in the van was beginning to curdle into despair. Maybe the ad was a mistake. Maybe they had shown their hand too early. And then, a man broke away from the flow of the crowd and walked toward the bench. He was average in every way. Mid-50s, thinning hair, wearing an ill-fitting jacket and jeans. He looked more like a tired accountant than a master art thief. He sat down on the other end of the bench, leaving a small space between himself and the undercover officer. He didn't look at the detective. He just stared ahead at the fountain. The hidden microphones picked up his voice, the same unremarkable voice from the phone. "You have what I want?" he asked, his gaze still fixed on the water. The undercover officer didn't flinch. "I do," he replied calmly. "If you have what my client wants." The man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a cell phone. He showed the officer a picture on the screen. It was the Saliera, sitting on what looked like a workbench in a cluttered basement. It was proof. The man then gestured toward the briefcase. "Let me see it." The officer unlatched the briefcase and opened it just enough for the man to see the stacks of euros on top. The man nodded, a flicker of greed in his eyes. He seemed satisfied. He closed his phone and put it back in his pocket. "It's been a pleasure," he said, reaching for the briefcase. This was the moment. The undercover officer placed a hand on the case, stopping him. He looked up at the glass ceiling of the mall, as if noticing the sky for the first time. "The weather," he said, his voice clear and steady, "is certainly nice today." For a split second, nothing happened. The man on the bench simply looked confused. And then the world exploded into motion. From every direction, the shoppers, the janitors, the clerks, all converged. The man's head snapped left, then right, his eyes wide with disbelief as he saw the sea of ordinary faces transform into a phalanx of determined police officers. He had nowhere to run. Before he could even stand up, he was surrounded, hands grabbing his arms, forcing him to the ground. The arrest was swift, professional, and brutally efficient. As the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, Chief Inspector Geiger stepped out of the surveillance van, his face a grim mask of triumph. He had finally caught his ghost. Back at the station, the man sat in a sterile interrogation room, the illusion of the ordinary man stripped away, replaced by the harsh reality of a captured felon. His name was Robert Mang, a security systems expert, an electronics specialist. He was the man who had installed alarm systems in dozens of Vienna's museums and galleries. He knew their weaknesses because he had designed their strengths. He had used his insider knowledge, his expertise, to bypass the very systems he was paid to protect. He was defiant at first, refusing to speak. But as the hours wore on and the weight of his capture settled in, the defiance began to crack. Geiger and his team had their man. They had the architect of the most audacious art heist in Austrian history. They had a signed confession. They had everything. Everything except the one thing that mattered most. When they asked him where the Saliera was, Robert Mang just smiled. A cold, empty smile. He told them he had buried it. He had packed it in a lead-lined box and buried it in a forest outside of a small village north of Vienna. And then he said the words that sent a chill down every officer's spine. "I don't remember exactly where." The forest was vast. The ground was frozen solid. And somewhere beneath the snow and soil lay a $60 million masterpiece, slowly being crushed by the earth. For the Austrian authorities, it was a nightmare scenario. Their single lead, their only hope of recovery, was a man who claimed his memory was a blank. The police were in an impossible position. They had their man, but he was holding the Saliera hostage inside his own mind. A massive search operation was launched. Hundreds of police officers, equipped with metal detectors and sniffer dogs trained to find buried objects, descended on the forests around the town of Brand. They combed through the woods day after day, in the bitter January cold. The media went into a frenzy. Helicopters circled overhead, capturing images of the desperate search. The pressure was immense. Every passing hour increased the risk of the delicate artwork being damaged by moisture, by the pressure of the frozen ground, by the simple act of being buried in a box like common treasure. But it was hopeless. The search area was enormous, and Mang's directions were vague at best. "A forest," he'd said, "near a village." It was like looking for a single specific grain of sand on a beach. The police knew it. The public knew it. And most of all, Robert Mang knew it. He was the only person on Earth who could lead them to it. And as the days turned into a week, it became clear this wasn't just a case of a bad memory. This was a power play. Mang was negotiating. From his jail cell, he was pulling the strings. He wanted assurances. He wanted a deal. His lawyer argued that he was cooperating, that he was trying his best to remember. But the police saw it for what it was, the final move in his audacious game. He had beaten the museum's security, he had evaded capture for years, and now he was trying to beat the justice system itself. He held the ultimate bargaining chip. Finally, after a week of this agonizing standoff, Mang remembered. He agreed to lead the police to the spot. On January 21, 2006, a convoy of police vehicles drove Robert Mang out of Vienna and into the countryside. He sat in the back, calmly giving directions, leading them down country roads to the small town of Brand. He directed them to a patch of woods just off the road. He got out of the car, looked around for a moment, and then pointed to a spot near the base of a tree. "Here," he said. There was a frantic scramble. Officers with shovels began to dig into the frozen earth. With every scrape of metal against dirt, the tension mounted. Was he telling the truth? Was this another game? Or would they find an empty box, a final cruel joke from the man who had humiliated them? After digging down about 3 feet, a shovel struck something hard. It wasn't a rock. It was metal. Carefully, they cleared the dirt away, revealing a large, heavy lead-lined box. They lifted it from the hole. It was caked in mud and ice. The world's media, held back by a police cordon, strained to get a picture. With painstaking care, officers prized the lid open. And there, nestled inside on a bed of old cloth, was the Saliera. It was dirty, but it was there. The golden figures of the sea and the earth, the tiny, perfect ship for salt, the temple for pepper. It was whole. It was undamaged. A collective sigh of relief, so profound it was almost audible, swept through the assembled crowd of police and officials. The heist was finally over. Back in Vienna, the Saliera was treated like a returning hero. It was meticulously cleaned and examined by experts. Miraculously, despite being buried in a frozen forest for weeks, it had suffered no significant damage. The lead box and Mang's careful packing had protected it. When it was finally put back on display, the lines to see it snaked around the block. The theft, the hunt, and the recovery had transformed it from a priceless masterpiece into a global legend. It was now the Mona Lisa of sculptures, famous not just for its beauty, but for its incredible story of being stolen and returned. The museum, having learned its lesson in the most painful way possible, installed a new state-of-the-art security system. The Saliera would never be so vulnerable again. And what of Robert Mang, the man at the center of it all? He was no criminal mastermind in the traditional sense. He was a security expert who saw a flaw and couldn't resist the temptation to exploit it. His trial was a media circus. He pleaded guilty, expressing remorse for the anxiety he had caused. He claimed he never intended to damage or sell the Saliera. He just wanted to possess it, to prove that he could. The prosecution pushed for a harsh sentence, highlighting the cultural vandalism and the massive cost of the investigation. But the defense painted a different picture. That of a troubled but brilliant man, an amateur who got in way over his head. A man who, crucially, led them to the artwork's location, ensuring its safe return. The judges seemed to agree. In Austria, the law looks more favorably on thieves if the stolen property is recovered. Robert Mang was sentenced to just 5 years in prison. He was released after serving less than 3 for good behavior. He faded back into obscurity, his one spectacular act of defiance, a bizarre and brilliant chapter in an otherwise ordinary life. In the end, the question that lingers is why? Why would a man with no criminal record, a stable life, and a deep knowledge of security systems risk everything to steal something he could never sell, never show to anyone, and could barely even look at himself? The answer seems to lie not in greed, but in ego. For Robert Mang, the Saliera wasn't an object worth $60 million. It was the ultimate puzzle. It was a challenge thrown down by the world's best security engineers, and he proved he could solve it. The theft wasn't about the money. It was about the thrill of the game. It was about owning, for a brief time, something utterly unobtainable. He kept it under his bed. He looked at it in the dead of night. For 2 years he was the secret keeper of one of the world's greatest treasures. He was the man who outsmarted the system. In his mind, he wasn't a common thief. He was an artist in his own right, and the heist was his masterpiece. The story of the Saliera is a testament to the genius of Benvenuto Cellini, but it's also a bizarre monument to the audacity of Robert Mang. A reminder that the greatest treasures in the world are protected not just by glass and alarms, but by a delicate social contract. And that sometimes it only takes one person with the right knowledge and the right amount of nerve to break it, plunging the art world into chaos and creating a legend for the ages.